Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, dear listeners, hello and welcome back to the podcast, and welcome to the third episode in the Muscle Masterclass series. Last week we talked about 3 fundamental variables for hypertrophy: volume, intensity of effort, and form. This week we'll be talking about split, session and exercise order, and exercise selection. Let's start with the split. First of all, there is no best split in quotation marks. The best split for you is the one that best serves your goals at that moment in time. And it depends on your priority muscles, because these are the muscles that you want to allocate the most volume to, or the most amount of sets throughout the week. I'll give you a practical example of several splits that can serve the same goal. Let's say that somebody wants to train 3 times per week and they want to grow the major muscle groups in their body, so their back, chest, delts, hamstrings, and quads, with a specific focus on their upper body. I can think of 3 different splits that can cover this goal, starting from a split that takes a more holistic approach to volume, to where we're spreading the volume across all major muscle groups somewhat evenly, to more and more increasingly upper body biased programs. So the most holistic type of split would be training full body 3 times. You're spreading the volume more evenly across the major muscle groups, but you can still prioritize the upper body with your exercise order within each session. The second example that I can think of, which is a bit more upper body biased, would be an upper-lower full body split, where the volume is more clearly directed towards your upper body, and the session order also biases the upper body. The final split, which is the most upper body focused, would be upper, lower, upper, to where you're doing minimal lower body volume. So you're either making very slow lower body gains, or you're just maintaining the size of your legs so that you can prioritize upper body the most. In this example, there's no best or worst split. It all depends on your goals and on your preferences. I've designed programs with all of these splits, depending on the client. Also, don't be beholden to the most popular splits like full body, upper lower, push-pull legs. Just because they're popular doesn't mean that they're the only ones that are correct in quotation marks. You can also think outside of the box. For example, I've programmed hamstrings and chest sessions and quads and back sessions before, instead of upper and lower. Ultimately, your split is simply a vehicle for the volume that you're allocating to all of your muscle groups. So think of it with that reasoning in mind, first and foremost. Now let's move on to session and exercise order. Importantly, the first session in your training week and the first exercise in any session are the ones that you're freshest for, that you have the most energy for. Therefore, your first session should target your top priority muscles. For instance, after top surgery, I decided I wanted to focus more on my legs than on my upper body, because leading up to top surgery, I'd spent years focusing primarily on my upper body, and in the final year before surgery, specifically on my chest. After surgery, I really wanted to focus on growing my quads, which have always been difficult for me to improve upon. So my program ever since then has featured a quad-focused lower body session as the first one in the training week. And the first exercises in that session are all quad biased exercises. Within any individual session, you want your first exercise to either target one of your top priority muscles or to be the most technical exercise in that session, or both if it works out that way. Because the more tired you are, the harder it becomes to perform well on a technically demanding lift, like a Romanian deadlift or most deadlift variations. Finally, I'm gonna give you some more advanced exercise order tips. A programming technique or strategy that I love that has to do with exercise order is called pre-exhaust or pre-fatigue. What it entails is you're going to perform an isolation exercise for your target muscle first. After the isolation exercise, you're going to move on to a compound exercise that targets the target muscle that you just stimulated with the isolation exercise, as well as other muscle groups. I think that this technique or this strategy is great to build mind muscle connection because you're going to fatigue the target muscle in the isolation lift, and you'll definitely feel it working harder in the compound lift, or you feel it working more than you would if you hadn't done the isolation lift first, because often with compound lifts, it's hard to isolate the specific muscles involved, which makes sense because they're usually technical and involve more than one joint and therefore more than one muscle. In addition to that, if you're pre-fatiguing a muscle with an isolation lift, it's more likely to become the limiting factor in the compound lift. For example, if you do chest flies before a barbell bench press, and normally your triceps take over or they fatigue first, and that's why you need to stop your sets. If you've already pre-fatigued your chest, now there's a greater chance that they're going to be the reason why you have to end a set. It's because it's the pecs that have hit failure as opposed to your triceps hitting failure first and your chest still having more to give, and therefore you're leaving some chest gains on the table. Last but not least, you're also going to use a lower load when you're performing a compound lift after an isolation lift, which is safer and potentially better, especially if you have sensitive joints that you can't load with excessive weight on a compound lift. So I absolutely love the pre-exhaust or pre-fatigue technique for its versatility and all these potential benefits. The other advanced exercise order tip I have is about performing mini sessions outside of your main sessions. This is for people who want to prioritize smaller muscles like biceps and triceps, but they don't want to perform lifts for these muscles first because they could then compromise muscle groups that they also want to prioritize. For example, if you were to perform your bicep curls at the start of a pull session, it would definitely impact your ability to perform well on your pull-ups and rows, and you might not want to sacrifice your back training for the sake of your biceps training. At the same time, you also don't want to always perform your biceps work at the end of a pull session because equally you'll be fatigued from doing the rowing and pulling work, so you won't be able to stimulate the biceps as well as you would if you were fresher. That's when mini sessions come in handy, whereby you would complete your main session for your major muscle groups at your preferred training time, and then you would train your biceps and or your triceps or whatever other smaller muscle we're talking about separately later in the day. And this works especially well if you have some home equipment, because I, for example, would not want to go to the gym twice in the same day because of the commuting time. This way, you're more recovered and you're fresher to perform well on these smaller muscle exercises, and you're also not compromising the other bigger muscle groups. For instance, I usually train between 9 and 11 a.m. in the morning, and then I would tack on an extra mini session for my biceps or the triceps at the moment towards 5 p.m., right before my final meal of the day, but several hours after my main session, so that I've had time to eat at least a couple of meals and to recover. If you're concerned that training your biceps or your triceps at the end of the day, for instance, might compromise a future session if you train early in the morning the next day, I've found that biceps in particular recover relatively quickly and they don't really affect a session even the next day. Whereas triceps can sometimes recover a little bit more slowly for some people because they're bigger than the biceps, in which case you can simply schedule them so that you're not training chest and delts the next day, because compound lifts that train chest and or delts will also to an extent involve the triceps. So you can work around the potential recovery issue, but typically with lateral delts, biceps, triceps, calves, and abs, and also traps, I don't find that the fatigue is so great, even though you may not have 24 hours between a mini session for one of these and a major session or a main session for some major muscle groups that involve lifts that also indirectly train these smaller muscle groups. Wrapping up this part on session and exercise order, I'm now going to focus on the topic that's probably going to take up the majority of this podcast, which is exercise selection. What's important to understand about exercise selection is that hypertrophy is a far more forgiving adaptation than strength, meaning that strength is specific to the lift that you're doing. If you want to get a stronger squat, you need to be squatting, most of the time at least. It doesn't work like that for hypertrophy because we're not trying to get a stronger squat, we're trying to get bigger quads or a bigger set of glutes. So you can do a ton of different lifts as long as they train the muscle that you want to grow. But some lifts can be more effective than others per unit of volume, meaning a set of certain exercises may be more effective than a set of other exercises. So if you're doing the other exercises, you may need to do more sets to make up for the lower efficacy. And I'm referring specifically to compound and isolation lifts. Compound lifts work more than one joint and therefore more than one muscle, like Romanian deadlifts, squats, and bench presses. And they are typically more effective per unit of volume than isolation exercises, which work a single joint and therefore a single muscle, like lateral raises, biceps curls, or triceps extensions. For example, one set of leg press is likely more stimulative than one set of leg extensions. So if you could only choose one or the other, then I'd choose the leg press because of its time efficiency. Whereas if you were to choose the leg extension, you would have to do some more sets in order to equate the stimulus. Now, I'm sure you're wondering how many more sets, and unfortunately, we can't really say. It's going to depend on the person, and you can only make an educated guess if you're not quite sure. Having said that, in most circumstances, you won't have to choose a compound lift or an isolation lift. I recommend that you perform a variety of both in your program because they each have their own uses. For example, if we stick with the leg extension versus leg press comparison, the leg extension may be more stimulative per unit of volume, but it tends to train the rectus femoris, which is one of the muscles within the quadricep muscle group, better than compound squatting patterns. In addition to that, different exercises are going to change the stimulus that each muscle receives, even when the difference is very minor. For example, a line hamstring curl, based on some research, some recent research we have, seems to target the sartorius muscle a little bit better than the seated hamstring curl, whereas the seated hamstring curl seems to target the hamstrings a little bit better than the line variation. Or rather, I'm saying better or worse. What I mean to say is that the lying curl might bias the sartorius a little bit more, whereas the seated curl may bias the hamstrings a little bit more relative to the sartorius. Another example would be that the higher the incline when you're doing a bench press, the more upper chest and delt focused the lift. Now, in this particular podcast or in this mini series, I'm not going to cover every single nuance of exercise selection because here I really want to focus on macro level concepts that are going to help you design a training program as opposed to the details of exercise selection. But in general, we have some evidence to show that using different exercises over time seems to be better for hypertrophy as opposed to always keeping the same exact exercises for years on end. So don't think this exercise is better than that exercise, but rather each exercise has its own benefits. So you want to switch up exercise selection over time. Furthermore, no exercise is useless, which I think is important to bring up because these days there is a corner of the fitness industry that seems to suggest that unless you can do a very specific exercise variation that you may not even have access to based on your equipment availability, then there's no point trying to build a specific muscle, which could not be any further from the truth. Yes, some exercises have some advantages over others, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that if you can only do dumbbell lateral raises and you don't have access to cables, then you're not going to see major lateral delt gains, because I don't believe that's necessarily true. And I don't want anybody to think that the barrier to entry to effective training is any higher than it is already perceived to be by many people. My job is to lower the barrier to entry to fitness as much as possible, and I always strive to do exactly that. In any case, we want to vary exercise selection over time wherever possible, but we don't want to change exercises too often because learning a lift properly takes time. So, first, you need to give yourself the opportunity to master the technique, which, depending on how experienced you are and how new this exercise is to you, may take from a single workout to several weeks or months, and sometimes even years of practice. Now, the immediate learning process where we're undergoing neuromuscular adaptations, meaning our nervous system is learning to recruit our muscle fibers in the right order to perform that specific movement. This neuromuscular adaptations phase typically takes up to 10 weeks, even in more beginner trainees. So you want to give yourself at least 2 to 3 months to practice an exercise to make sure that these adaptations take place. And it's past that point that you really want to focus on milking out as many gains as you can out of that particular exercise, chasing progressive overload. When progressive overload is no longer occurring, or when you get bored to death of that particular lift and that boredom is starting to threaten your consistency, then it's time for a change. In summary, there are no best exercises. Machines and free weights have been found to have similar effects on hypertrophy, so a barbell exercise isn't necessarily better than a machine-based exercise. Compound and isolation lifts all have their uses. And finally, different exercise variations can provide different stimuli that can all contribute to growth. When it comes to choosing an exercise for your program, I'm going to give you some considerations to make that can help you make a suitable decision for that particular program and that particular session. First of all, you need to consider equipment availability. Second of all, can you perform the exercise safely with little to no discomfort or pain? Third, can you reach a close enough proximity to failure to stimulate hypertrophy efficiently? Four, can you progress that lift in terms of reps and or load over time in order to generate? Because progressive overload is the best proxy measure that we have for muscle growth. In other words, it's the best way to tell if you're growing muscle, since visual changes are typically a lot slower and they're also affected by your body composition at the time and whether you're cutting or bulking. Progressive overload is also required for muscle growth to occur to begin with. So it's both a way to measure hypertrophy and a way to generate it. The speed at which you can expect progressive overload also changes with your training experience, where it's faster the more of a beginner you are, and it's slower as you get more advanced. So when you're asking yourself whether progressive overload is happening, you need to consider whether it's happening at a pace that you can expect relative to your current experience level. There is no one size fits all when it comes to pace, but beginners typically can add reps and or a little bit of load almost every workout. Intermediates tend to be able to do it every 1 or 2 weeks on average, whereas the most advanced trainees do it less often than every 1 or 2 weeks. So, in the long term, your training experience is the main long term factor affecting progressive overload. But in the short term, other factors that can have an impact are also your stress levels, your sleep quality and duration, your energy levels, the nutrient density and caloric intake of your diet, and your menstrual cycle. So, you don't want to focus on your performance in just one workout, but on the trend over time. So, if you have one workout where your performance is a little bit meh or absolutely incredible, is not yet a trend, because by definition, a trend requires at least two data points or two workouts. And if you're an advanced lifter and you require a long time to see progressive overload in the way of an increase in reps and load, you want to consider some other signs that progressive overload may be occurring, which are more short term, like an improvement in mind muscle connection, which is a sign that you likely have more precise technique than before. And even at the same load and reps, you're likely stimulating the target muscles better. Another sign is better form, which again will lead to a better stimulus, because if with your previous form, maybe you were stimulating your target muscle 80% of the way, with 20% taken over by another muscle which was compensating for the less precise form, now maybe you're getting 90% of the stimulus to the target muscle because of the improvement in form. Finally, you might be doing the same reps and load, but at a lower RPE, so you're further away from failure, which is actually progressive overload because it means that the set has gotten easier than it was before. Even with these short term signs, I understand that it can become discouraging to have to wait that long for a change in reps and load. So, this is a way to positively reframe that apparent stall. If your reps and or your load stay the same, it's not because progressive overload is not happening. It's not because you're not making progress. It's because those reps and that load are still generating progressive overload. To wrap up this relatively lengthy tangent I ended up going on about progressive overload, there could come a time when you realize that your performance is not changing at a pace that makes sense relative to your experience level, and you may want to make a change to try to bust that plateau. In this situation, if only one exercise is effective, then I recommend revising your technique and your intensity of effort first and foremost, because maybe your form has gone a little bit to shit because you've been trying to add more reps and more load at the expense of technique. Or maybe you think you're training as hard as you say you're training, but you're actually training a little bit further from failure than you believed, so you need to put a little bit more effort into it. If you know that both your form and your intensity of effort are on point, you could also try to change the rep range. For example, if you've been doing that lift in the 8 to 12 repetition range, try 15 to 20, or vice versa. Or you might implement a time efficient technique like switching to drop sets instead of straight sets. Sometimes these programming strategies can help bust plateaus. If that also doesn't make a difference, at that point, rotate that exercise out and introduce a new one altogether. On the other hand, if one entire muscle group is affected, whereby multiple lifts for that muscle group don't seem to be improving, and you don't see visual changes in that muscle group in terms of size increases, then there are three solutions for you to consider. You need more precise form to target that muscle group, and or you need to do more volume or more sets per week for that muscle group, and or you need to train closer to failure. Now, the reason why I went on this tangent was that I was talking about making sure, or at least thinking about, whether you can progress a certain lift relatively easily in terms of reps and or load over time. There are, however, other ways to progress a lift which can come in handy when you don't have a ton of load availability, which is very common if you train from home and you're performing body weight exercises, and maybe you have resistance bands and dumbbells, but obviously you might not have access to the load availability of a commercial gym. In this case, these other strategies to generate progressive overload include changing the tempo. For instance, if you slow down the eccentric, you're going to make the exercise harder. So it's a bit like increasing the weight without obviously increasing the weight. You can move to a more challenging variation. For instance, if you've been doing hands elevated push ups and you're smashing 20 rep sets of those, you can lower the elevation or move to the floor to make the exercise harder. Again, this is a way of increasing the load without actually adding weight. You can also include a resistance band if you've been using just your body weight or a dumbbell, and you can use the dumbbell and the resistance band together to add a little bit more resistance, probably not throughout the range of motion because bands obviously get taut and then they slacken. So when they're slack, you're not going to get the extra load or tension, but you are going to experience it when they tense up. And one more strategy for progressive overload that doesn't require changing load is playing with your range of motion. For example, if you limit the range of motion to the lengthened partial range of motion, you're going to be able to do more reps with the same weight because you're stronger in that range of motion typically, and because you're only performing half of the repetition, of course. Whereas vice versa, if you then increase the range of motion to a full range of motion, you're going to make that same lift more challenging. In summary, being able to increase reps and or load is the easiest way to generate progressive overload. But it doesn't mean that if you can't do that, you cannot choose another exercise. It just means that you're going to have to get more creative when it comes to generating progressive overload. So hopefully, the strategies that I've just suggested are going to give you some food for thought in that respect. Now, to wrap up this episode, I want to bring all of these variables together and give you a practical example of an imaginary client with this goal. They want to prioritize upper body growth, especially in their chest, for top surgery. But they also want to grow all of the major muscle groups in their body to develop an even and balanced physique. They can only train 3 times per week. So, together, this imaginary client of mine and I decide upon this split: upper, lower, and full body, starting the week with upper, lower in the middle, and full body at the end. And as a practical example, I'm going to give you the full upper session 1. It's going to start with a pec deck fly, 3 sets to pre-fatigue the pecs. Then we're going to have a superset that includes an incline dumbbell bench press to bias the upper back division of the chest a little bit more. And we're going to do 3 sets of that in a superset with a dumbbell torso supported row on the same bench. And we're going to perform 3 sets of that exercise as well. At this point, we've completed the amount of work we wanted to do for the pecs. So we've got a little bit more work dedicated to the back, and it's going to be 3 sets of a neutral grip lat pull down, because the row is to be performed with a pronated grip, meaning we're going to focus a little bit more on the upper back. And with a neutral grip on the lat pull down, we can bias the lats a little bit more instead. So we get equal amounts of volume for both the lats and the upper back. At this point, this client has performed 4 exercises and they have time for 1 more. So we dedicate the final part of the session to growing their lateral delts, and we perform cable lateral raises with the pulley level with their wrist, because in that position the exercise is more lengthened bias, and having lengthened bias is likely to generate a little bit more growth than potentially having a shortened bias, at least based on the most recent evidence I'm aware of. And since we don't have a ton of time to add more direct lateral delt work, because the client has time for only a final exercise instead of 2, then choosing an exercise that gives you a greater bang for your buck, potentially, like a lengthened bias exercise, is likely a better choice. Hence why I want to have a lengthened bias cable lateral raise. And we're going to do 3 sets, and then a 4th set, which is going to be a drop set. And I'm going to cover the benefits of drop sets in the next episode, but in short, we're going to include it because it's going to be very time efficient. A whole drop set is going to take about 5 minutes, and based on research, it seems to be somewhat equal in terms of hypertrophy to 3 standard sets if you perform 1 initial set plus 3 drops, which obviously makes it excellent to save time and generate a little bit more stimulus. But again, more on these time-efficient techniques in the next episode of the Muscle Masterclass series. On that note, thank you very much for tuning in. As always, if you want to work with me, please apply through the links in the show notes. And if you can spare the time to leave me a review or at least a 5-star rating, then please do so, because it really helps me reach more people with this podcast. And thank you, as always, for giving me some of your time. As always, I look forward to talking to you again in the next episode. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.